The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready. Among them stood Marcus Bush, a wealthy American businessman who had made his fortune in real estate. At 52, Marcus was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. His expensive suit and confident demeanor marked him as someone accustomed to respect and attention. Marcus had come to London for a business deal worth millions, but today was his tourist day. He'd promised his wife Sarah he would visit the famous landmark she'd always dreamed of seeing. The changing of the guard ceremony was at the top of her list, though Marcus found the whole thing rather silly. Men in funny hats marching around in perfect formation seemed like an outdated tradition to him. As the ceremony began, Marcus watched with mild interest. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their red uniforms pristine, their tall black hats adding an imposing height to their already impressive stature. Their faces remained completely expressionless, looking straight ahead as if nothing in the world could disturb their concentration. "Look at them," Marcus chuckled to his wife, speaking loudly enough for other tourists to hear. "They're like toy soldiers. I bet I could make one of them crack a smile without even trying." Sarah frowned at her husband's comment. She had always admired the discipline and tradition of the British Royal Guard, but Marcus saw only an opportunity for entertainment. The other tourists around them began to take notice of the loud American, who seemed determined to make a scene. One particular guard caught Marcus's attention. The young man stood perfectly still at his post, his rifle held at exactly the right angle, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Everything about him screamed military precision, from his polished boots to his perfectly positioned hat. "Watch this," Marcus whispered to Sarah, then raised his voice. "Hey there, soldier boy, nice hat. Where did you get it, the costume shop?" The guard didn't even blink. His expression remained as stone-cold as before, giving no indication that he had heard the comment at all. This only encouraged Marcus further. "I'm talking to you, Redcoat," Marcus called out, stepping closer to the rope barrier that separated tourists from the guards. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore someone when they're speaking to you?" Other tourists began to shift uncomfortably. Some pulled out their phones to record what was clearly becoming an embarrassing situation. Sarah tugged at Marcus's sleeve, trying to get him to stop, but he brushed her off. He was enjoying the attention now, feeding off the reactions of the crowd. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. Tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, but this American was being particularly persistent and rude. "You know what I think?" Marcus continued, his voice getting louder. "I think you're just playing dress-up. This whole thing is just theater for the tourists. You're probably just some kid from the streets who needed a job." The crowd around them grew larger as word spread about the rude American tourist making a scene. Some people looked embarrassed for Marcus, while others seemed to be waiting to see how far he would push things. The guard remained motionless, but those who knew what to look for could see the slight tension in his jaw. Marcus wasn't finished. He had built his business empire by being aggressive and never backing down, and he applied the same approach to everything in life. "I bet you don't even know how to use that rifle," he taunted. "It's probably not even loaded. The whole thing is just for show." An elderly British gentleman standing nearby finally spoke up. "Sir, please show some respect. These men serve our country with honor." Marcus turned to face the man, his face red with indignation. "Respect for what? Standing still and looking pretty? In America, our soldiers actually fight wars instead of playing dress-up for tourists." The comment sparked murmurs of disapproval from the British tourists, but Marcus didn't care. He was on a roll now, determined to prove his point about what he saw as meaningless tradition. He turned back to the guard, who still hadn't moved so much as an eyelash. "You want to know what real service looks like? It's about building things, creating jobs, making something of yourself, not standing around in a costume pretending to be important." Sarah finally managed to grab her husband's arm firmly. "Marcus, please, you're embarrassing us. Let's just go." But Marcus shook her off again. He was enjoying the audience too much to stop now. The guard had become a symbol of everything Marcus thought was wrong with old-world traditions. Everything he believed his modern, success-driven approach to life had surpassed. "Look at him," Marcus announced to the crowd. "He can't even defend himself." "What kind of soldier is that?" "In my country, a man speaks up for himself." The guard's breathing remained steady, But inside his helmet, behind the expressionless face that had been trained to show no emotion, thoughts and memories were stirring. This wasn't the first time someone had mocked his service, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this particular American's arrogance cut deeper than usual. The crowd continued to grow, and Marcus found himself at the center of attention just the way he liked it. He had no idea that his words were being heard not just by tourists and casual observers, but by people who understood the true meaning of the uniform the guard wore and the sacrifice it represented. As Marcus prepared to launch into another round of insults, completely unaware of what he was about to learn, the guard remained at his post, professional and disciplined. But inside that red coat beat the heart of someone whose story would soon change Marcus Bush's entire perspective on what real service meant. The situation was spiraling out of control, and everyone could sense it. Marcus Bush stood there like a man possessed, his voice carrying across the courtyard as more tourists stopped to watch the spectacle. What had started as casual mockery had transformed into something much more aggressive and personal. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus continued, pointing directly at the motionless guard. "You've been told you're special for so long that you actually believe it. But look around. The real world doesn't care about your fancy marching and your silly ceremonies. While you're standing here playing soldier, real men are out there building empires and changing the world." The guard's name was James Mitchell, though Marcus would never know that from looking at him. At 24 years old, James had already served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious role of Queen's Guard. The selection process was incredibly demanding, requiring not just physical fitness and military excellence, but also the mental strength to maintain absolute composure under any circumstances. James had learned long ago how to shut out the noise, how to find that quiet place in his mind where insults and taunts couldn't reach him. But today was different. Today those words were hitting something raw, something that still ached despite all his training and discipline. "I'm talking to you," Marcus shouted, his patience finally running out. "The least you can do is acknowledge that someone is speaking to you. Don't they teach you manners in soldier school?" A group of British veterans who happened to be visiting the palace for a memorial service began to gather at the edge of the crowd. They recognized what was happening immediately. They had all worn the uniform at some point in their lives, and they knew the discipline it took to stand there and take abuse without reacting. One of them, a grizzled man in his 70s named William Thompson, stepped forward. His chest was decorated with service medals from conflicts spanning decades. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Marcus in a firm but polite voice, "but you're making quite a scene." Marcus turned to face the old man, sizing him up with a dismissive glance. "And you are?" "Someone who knows what that uniform means," William replied. "That young man you're harassing has earned the right to wear it through service and sacrifice that you clearly don't understand." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that made several tourists wince. "Service and sacrifice? He's standing still. My 5-year-old nephew could do that job. In fact, he'd probably do it better because at least he'd have the courtesy to respond when someone speaks to him." "That man has served his country in ways you can't imagine," William said, his voice growing harder. "He's earned his place there through blood, sweat, and dedication. Has he now?" Marcus shot back. "And what would you know about it? You look like you haven't worked a day of hard labor in your life. Let me tell you something about real service. I employ 300 people in my company. I've built schools and hospitals. I've created jobs and opportunities. That's real service to society, not this costume party nonsense." The crowd was getting restless now. Some tourists were starting to leave, uncomfortable with the aggressive confrontation. Others were taking videos, which would later appear on social media with various commentary about ugly Americans abroad. Sarah Bush stood to the side, her face red with embarrassment, desperately wishing her husband would stop. James continued to stare straight ahead, but his mind was elsewhere now. He was remembering a dust-covered village in Afghanistan, where he and his unit had been stationed during his second deployment. He was thinking about the children who used to gather around their camp, eager for chocolate and stories about America. He was remembering the day everything changed. "You want to know what I think?" Marcus was saying, his voice getting more aggressive by the minute. "I think this whole thing is a scam. These aren't real soldiers. They're actors hired to play a part for tourists like us. Real soldiers are out there fighting real battles, not playing dress-up in London." That comment struck particularly deep. James had lost friends in those real battles. He had carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire. He had made decisions in seconds that determined whether people lived or died. The uniform he wore now was not a costume but a symbol of honor, earned through experiences that haunted his dreams. William Thompson was no longer trying to be polite. "Sir, you need to stop this immediately." "You don't know what you're talking about, and you're dishonoring not just that guard but every person who has ever worn a military uniform." "Dishonoring?" Marcus scoffed. "The only thing being dishonored here is common decency. This guy won't even have the courtesy to acknowledge another human being. Where I come from, that's called being rude." The old veteran's eyes flashed with anger. "Where you come from, they apparently don't teach respect or common sense. That guard is doing his job, which requires him to maintain discipline and composure despite provocations from people like you." Marcus was getting frustrated now. He had expected to either get a reaction from the guard or at least have the crowd on his side. Instead, he found himself being criticized by strangers who seemed to understand something he didn't. But rather than backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. "Let me make this simple for everyone," Marcus announced loudly. "This guard, this ceremony, this whole tradition is nothing but a tourist attraction. It has no real meaning, no real purpose, and no real value. It's just Britain hanging on to old-fashioned ideas because they can't accept that the world has moved on." James felt something crack inside him. Not his discipline, which remained intact, but something deeper. The words were hitting too close to thoughts he had struggled with since returning from combat. Questions about purpose, about whether his service meant anything, about whether the sacrifices made by him and his fallen comrades had any real value in a world that seemed increasingly focused on money and success. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, with more arriving every minute. Palace security was beginning to take notice, and several guards were quietly moving into position. They couldn't interfere directly with a tourist who wasn't breaking any laws, but they were prepared to act if the situation escalated further. Marcus sensed he was losing his audience, so he decided to make one final, devastating comment that he thought would prove his point once and for all. What he didn't know was that his next words would set in motion a series of events that would change his entire understanding of service, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be a hero. Marcus Bush raised his voice for what he intended to be his final, crushing blow to what he saw as British pretension and empty tradition. The crowd had grown silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even the other guards seemed to tense slightly, though they maintained their rigid positions. "You want to know the truth about your precious guard?" Marcus shouted, his finger pointing directly at James. "He's probably never even seen real combat. He's probably some rich kid who joined the army to play soldier and ended up in this cushy job where all he has to do is stand around and look pretty for cameras. Meanwhile, real heroes are dying in real wars while he gets praised for doing absolutely nothing." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. William Thompson, the old veteran, closed his eyes and shook his head sadly. He knew something Marcus didn't, something that made those words not just ignorant but cruel beyond measure. Sarah Bush finally found her voice. "Marcus, please, that's enough. You're being horrible." But Marcus was too caught up in his own rhetoric to stop. "Horrible? I'm being honest. This guy represents everything that's wrong with the world today. People getting praised and honored for showing up and following orders instead of taking initiative and making something of themselves." At that moment, a woman in her 60s pushed through the crowd. Her name was Margaret Mitchell, and she had been visiting London to attend a military memorial service. When she heard the commotion and worked her way close enough to see what was happening, her heart nearly stopped. Standing there in the red uniform, maintaining perfect composure despite the verbal assault, was her son James. The son who had nightmares about things he couldn't talk about. The son who had come home from his second deployment changed, quieter, carrying weight in his eyes that no 24-year-old should have to bear. Margaret knew things about her son's service that would never appear in any official record. She knew about the village in Afghanistan where his unit had been stationed. She knew about the school they had helped rebuild and the children they had protected. She knew about the day when everything went wrong. "That's my son," she whispered to the person next to her, tears starting to form in her eyes. Marcus was still talking, oblivious to the woman's presence. "Look at him. He can't even defend himself. What kind of man lets someone insult him to his face and just stands there? In my business, you learn to fight for yourself or you get walked all over. Margaret couldn't stay silent anymore. She pushed forward through the crowd until she was standing directly in front of Marcus Bush. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I need you to stop talking about my son that way." Marcus looked at her with surprise, then glanced back at the guard. "Your son? Well, lady, maybe you should have taught him better manners. A real man responds when someone speaks to him. My son," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger, "is showing more courage right now than you've probably shown in your entire life. He's standing there taking your abuse because his duty requires it, because he's been trained to put service above his personal feelings." "Service?" Marcus laughed. "What service? Standing around in a costume?" Margaret's eyes flashed with anger and pain. "My son has served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He's seen things and done things that you couldn't handle for 5 minutes. He saved lives and risked his own life more times than I can count." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something profound and painful. James remained motionless, but those who looked carefully could see a slight tremor in his hands, the only sign that he was affected by his mother's presence and her words. "He came home different," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly, quieter. "He has nightmares that he won't talk about. But he continues to serve because he believes in something bigger than himself, something you clearly don't understand." Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty for the first time. The woman's pain was real and it was impossible to ignore. But he had built his entire persona around never backing down, never admitting he was wrong. "Look, lady, I'm sorry your son has problems, but that doesn't change the fact that this whole ceremony is just for show." "Just for show?" Margaret's voice rose. "Do you want to know what my son did to earn the right to wear that uniform? Do you want to know about the children he saved when insurgents attacked their school? Do you want to know about the soldiers he carried to safety under enemy fire?" The crowd was hanging on every word now. Several people were crying. Marcus found himself in a position he rarely experienced, being confronted with information that challenged his worldview. He was awarded the Military Cross for his actions in Afghanistan, Margaret continued. But he's never talked about it, never bragged about it, because that's not the kind of man he is. He serves quietly, with dignity, because he understands that real honor doesn't require recognition. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him. The Military Cross was Britain's 3rd highest military decoration for courage in combat. Even he knew that much. I didn't know," he said quietly. "Of course you didn't know," William Thompson interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Margaret. "Because you assumed you knew everything based on appearances. You saw a uniform and a ceremony and decided it was meaningless without bothering to learn anything about the person wearing it." The old veteran looked directly at James, and for just a moment their eyes met. William had served in the Falklands War decades earlier, and he recognized something in the young guard's eyes that civilians would never understand. The weight of command decisions, the burden of survival when others didn't make it home, the responsibility that came with being trusted with other people's lives. Marcus looked around at the crowd, seeing disapproval and disappointment in every face. His wife Sarah was crying, ashamed of her husband's behavior. The tourists who had initially been amused by his antics now looked at him with disgust. I was just trying to get a reaction," Marcus said weakly, his earlier confidence completely gone. "I didn't mean anything personal by it." "Every word was personal," Margaret said firmly. "My son stands there representing everyone who has ever served, everyone who has ever sacrificed for something bigger than themselves. When you mock him, you mock them all." The situation was about to take another turn that would reveal even more about the man behind the uniform, and Marcus Bush was about to learn something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus Bush stood there, his earlier bravado completely deflated, while Margaret Mitchell faced him with tears streaming down her face. The crowd had grown to over 100 people, all drawn by the drama unfolding before the silent guard. An elderly man with a military bearing pushed through the crowd, his chest heavy with medals from various conflicts. Colonel David Harrison was retired now, but he had served as James Mitchell's commanding officer during his deployment in Afghanistan. He had come to London for a memorial service and had heard about the commotion at the palace. When he saw James standing at his post, enduring the verbal assault with perfect discipline, Colonel Harrison's heart filled with pride and pain. He knew better than anyone what that young man had endured, what he had accomplished, and what it had cost him. "James Mitchell," the colonel said quietly as he approached the group, his voice carrying the authority of command even in retirement. "One of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve with." Marcus turned to face this new arrival, sensing immediately that this man was different from the others who had confronted him. There was something in the colonel's bearing, in the way he held himself, that commanded automatic respect. "You served with him?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "I commanded him," Colonel Harrison replied. "In Helmand Province, Afghanistan, during operations that I still can't fully discuss due to security classifications. But I can tell you this, Mr. Bush, Marcus Bush. Mr. Bush, that young man you've been insulting saved more lives in a single day than most people save in a lifetime. And it nearly destroyed him in the process." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. Margaret Mitchell reached out and took the colonel's arm, grateful for his presence and his willingness to speak for her son. "There was a school," the colonel began, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard, "in a village outside of Lashkar Gah. Our unit was responsible for security in the area, and we had been working with the local community to rebuild infrastructure damaged by years of conflict." Marcus found himself drawn into the story despite his earlier skepticism. There was something in the colonel's voice, a weight and authenticity that he couldn't dismiss. James had developed a particular connection with the children at that school, the colonel continued. He spoke some of the local language and he had a way with kids. They trusted him. Every morning he would walk the perimeter of the school, checking for threats, making sure it was safe for them to learn. James remained motionless at his post, but inside his helmet memories were flooding back. The faces of those children, their eager smiles when they saw him coming. The way they practiced English words they had learned, proud to show off for the tall British soldier who always had time for them. On March 15, 2023, the colonel continued, his voice growing heavier. "We received intelligence that insurgents were planning an attack on the school. James volunteered to lead a small team to provide additional security. It was meant to be a precautionary measure." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Sarah Bush had stopped crying and was staring at her husband, seeing him process information that was clearly changing his entire perspective on what he had witnessed. "The attack came at dawn," Colonel Harrison said. "Not just the insurgents we expected, but a coordinated assault with explosives, automatic weapons, and suicide bombers. They meant to send a message by targeting children who were trying to get an education." Marcus felt his stomach turn. The casual way he had mocked this man's service suddenly seemed not just inappropriate but monstrous. "James and his team were outnumbered 4-1, the colonel continued. The smart tactical decision would have been to fall back and call for reinforcements. But there were 87 children in that school along with their teachers. There wasn't time to wait for backup." Margaret Mitchell was crying again, remembering the phone call that had nearly stopped her heart. The formal language of military notification, the words "wounded in action" that had sent her world spinning. For 6 hours, James and 3 other soldiers held off that attack, the colonel said. They moved from room to room, evacuating children while under constant enemy fire. James personally carried 12 wounded children to safety, making multiple trips through areas that were being actively targeted by snipers. The crowd was mesmerized by the story, but Marcus was feeling something else entirely. Shame was washing over him in waves as he began to understand the magnitude of what the man he had mocked had actually experienced. "In the end," Colonel Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "all 87 children survived. Every single teacher made it out alive. But James's team paid a heavy price for that victory." The colonel paused, looking directly at the motionless guard. "Private Thompson didn't make it home. Corporal Davies lost his leg. Sergeant Williams still can't use his right arm properly. And James carried wounds that you can't see on the outside." Marcus felt like he was going to be sick. The man he had spent the last hour insulting as a pretend soldier, a costume-wearing actor, had risked everything to save children he didn't even know. The Military Cross citation mentions his exceptional courage under fire and his selfless dedication to protecting civilian lives. The colonel continued, "But it doesn't mention the nightmares he still has. It doesn't mention the guilt he carries about being the only member of his team who came home physically intact. It doesn't mention that he volunteered for this duty because serving as a Queen's Guard helps him feel like he's still making a difference. The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Marcus looked at the guard, James Mitchell, with completely different eyes. The rigid posture he had mocked was the bearing of a man who had stood firm when it mattered most. The silence he had criticized was the quiet strength of someone who had already proved his courage in ways that words could never capture. "I need to apologize," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. There was one more thing Marcus needed to understand, one more truth about the man behind the uniform that would complete his education in what real service meant. Colonel Harrison looked directly at Marcus Bush, his experienced eyes seeing right through the businessman's expensive suit to the insecurity and ignorance beneath. The colonel had dealt with many different types of people during his military career, and he recognized Marcus as someone who had never been truly tested, never been forced to confront what he was really made of. "There's something else you need to know, Mr. Bush," the colonel said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the crowd lean forward. "Something that makes your comments today particularly painful." Marcus swallowed hard, already dreading what he was about to hear. The shame he felt was growing heavier with each revelation about the man he had spent so much time insulting. After the school incident, James was offered early retirement with full honors. The colonel continued. He had already done more than enough. His service record was exemplary, his decorations spoke for themselves, and his psychological evaluation recommended that he be allowed to return home and begin the process of healing from what he had experienced. Margaret Mitchell nodded, remembering the difficult conversations she had with her son during his recovery period, the way he would stare out the window for hours, lost in thoughts he couldn't or wouldn't share, the way he would wake up in the middle of the night calling out names she didn't recognize. But James refused the early retirement, the colonel said. He insisted on completing his full term of service. More than that, he specifically requested assignment to the Queen's Guard, one of the most demanding and visible positions in the British military. Marcus was confused. Why would he do that? If he had been through so much, why not take the opportunity to go home? The colonel smiled sadly. That's exactly what I asked him, and his answer is something I'll never forget. He said, "Sir, those children trusted me to protect them, and I did. Now there are other people who need protecting, other duties that need to be fulfilled. I didn't join the army to serve only when it was easy or when I felt like it." The crowd was completely silent, absorbing the weight of that statement. Here was a man who had already given more than anyone could reasonably ask, yet chose to continue serving despite his own pain and trauma. "You see, Mr. Bush," the colonel continued, "when you mocked James for standing still, for following orders, for maintaining discipline, you were mocking the very qualities that saved 87 lives. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to follow procedures even when chaos is erupting around you, to put duty above personal comfort. These aren't weaknesses. They're strengths that most people will never possess." Sarah Bush was staring at her husband with a mixture of disappointment and pity. She had fallen in love with Marcus's confidence and drive, but she was seeing now how those qualities had blinded him to the value of things he didn't understand. An older woman standing near the front of the crowd spoke up. "I was one of the teachers at that school," she said in accented English. Her name was Fatima, and she had traveled to London specifically to attend a ceremony honoring the soldiers who had saved her and her students. The crowd turned to look at her, and Marcus felt his heart sink even further. It wasn't enough that he had insulted a decorated war hero. Now he was facing someone who had been directly saved by that hero's actions. "I remember Sergeant Mitchell very well," Fatima said, using James's rank from his Afghanistan service. "He would visit our school every morning, not because he had to, but because he cared about the children. He learned their names, asked about their families, encouraged them to continue their studies even when it was dangerous." She looked directly at James, who remained motionless at his post, though those who looked carefully could see moisture gathering in his eyes. On the day of the attack, when the shooting started, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He came toward the danger because he knew we needed help. Marcus wanted to disappear, to sink through the ground and escape from this nightmare of his own making. Every word from these people was like a hammer blow to his conscience. "My daughter was trapped in a classroom on the second floor," Fatima continued, her voice growing emotional. The stairs were blocked by debris from an explosion. Sergeant Mitchell climbed up the outside of the building, broke through a window, and carried her down while bullets were flying all around him. She wiped tears from her eyes. She is now studying medicine at university in London. She wants to be a doctor so she can help people the way Sergeant Mitchell helped her. Every day she says a prayer of thanks for the man who risked his life to save hers. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Marcus looked at the silent guard, understanding now that his mocking had been directed at someone who embodied everything he had claimed to value: courage, dedication, service to others. But James had demonstrated these qualities in ways that Marcus, for all his business success, had never been called upon to match. Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. "There's one more thing, Mr. Bush. Something that I think you particularly need to understand." After James recovered from his physical wounds, he was offered several lucrative positions in the private sector: security consulting, military contracting, corporate positions that would have paid him more in a year than he makes in 5 years as a Queen's Guard. Marcus looked up sharply. This was language he understood, the language of money and career advancement. "He turned them all down," the colonel said. "Every single one. When I asked him why, he said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said, 'Colonel, I didn't learn to serve so that I could stop serving. I learned to serve so that I could serve better.'" The businessman felt something crack inside his chest. All his life, he had measured success by financial achievement, by the accumulation of wealth and power. But standing here, listening to stories about a man who had repeatedly chosen duty over profit, service over self-advancement, Marcus was being forced to confront the possibility that his entire value system was fundamentally flawed. As the crowd absorbed this final revelation, Marcus Bush stood at a crossroads. He could try to salvage his pride, make excuses, and walk away unchanged. Or he could find the courage to face what he had done and what he had learned. The choice he made would define not just this moment, but the man he would be for the rest of his life. The silence that followed Colonel Harrison's final words seemed to last forever. Marcus Bush stood in the center of the crowd, feeling the weight of over 100 pairs of eyes upon him. His expensive suit felt heavy now, his confident demeanor completely shattered by the truth he had been forced to confront. For the first time in decades, Marcus Bush was truly speechless. The man who had built an empire through aggressive negotiation and unwavering self-confidence found himself face to face with his own profound ignorance and cruelty. Every word he had spoken in the last hour now seemed not just wrong but evil. James Mitchell remained at his post, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the emotional storm swirling around him. But inside his helmet, behind his expressionless facade, he was fighting his own battle. The stories being told about his service, the recognition of his sacrifices, it all brought back memories he worked every day to keep buried. Marcus looked at the guard, really looked at him for the first time. Not as a target for his mockery, not as a symbol of outdated tradition, but as a human being who had endured things Marcus couldn't even imagine. The steady breathing, the perfect posture, the unwavering discipline, all of it suddenly seemed not just admirable but miraculous. "I need to say something," Marcus finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd leaned in to hear him. "I need to apologize." He stepped closer to James, close enough to see his own reflection in the polished surface of the guard's ceremonial helmet. "I don't know your name," Marcus said, his voice breaking with emotion. "But I know now that you're a better man than I could ever hope to be." The words hung in the air, raw and honest in a way that surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. He had spent his entire adult life projecting strength and confidence, never admitting weakness or fault. But standing here, confronted with the reality of what true strength looked like, he found himself stripped of all pretense. "I came here today thinking I was successful, thinking I had achieved something meaningful with my life," Marcus continued, tears now flowing freely down his face. "I built a company, made money, employed people, and I thought that made me important. But you saved children. You risked your life for people you didn't even know. You chose service over profit, duty over comfort, and you continue to serve even though it costs you everything." Sarah Bush watched her husband with amazement. In 25 years of marriage, she had never seen him so vulnerable, so willing to admit he was wrong. The Marcus she knew never apologized, never showed weakness, Never let anyone see him cry. I mocked you for following orders, for maintaining discipline, for staying silent, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger now. But those aren't weaknesses. Those are the qualities that make heroes. You stood there and took my abuse because your duty required it. Because you understood something I was too ignorant and arrogant to see. Margaret Mitchell was crying again, but now they were tears of a different kind. For months she had watched her son struggle with doubt about whether his service mattered, whether the sacrifices he and his comrades had made meant anything in a world that seemed increasingly focused on material success. To hear this recognition, this acknowledgement of his worth, was healing something deep inside her heart. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. He had seen many apologies in his time, but this one felt genuine. Marcus Bush was not trying to save face or minimize his behavior. He was confronting the full weight of what he had done and what he had learned. I want everyone here to know, Marcus said, turning to address the crowd, that I was completely wrong about everything. This man represents the best of humanity. He embodies values that I had forgotten existed, values that my own pursuit of success had blinded me to. Fatima, the teacher from Afghanistan, stepped forward. Mr. Bush, she said gently, it takes courage to admit when we are wrong. Perhaps this experience will help you understand what true service means. Marcus nodded gratefully, then turned back to James. I know you can't respond to me while you're on duty, he said. I know your discipline won't allow it, but I hope somehow you can hear me when I say that I am deeply, profoundly sorry for everything I said. You deserve respect, honor, and gratitude, not the mockery of an ignorant man who confused wealth with worth. At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Without breaking his military bearing, without moving his head or changing his expression, James Mitchell did something he had never done while on duty before. A single tear rolled down his cheek, visible to everyone standing close enough to see. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement, the slightest crack in his professional facade, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, the crowd understood that beneath the uniform, beneath the discipline and training, was a human being who had been deeply affected by both the cruelty he had endured and the recognition he was now receiving. The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a sustained ovation. They were applauding not just James, but the moment of transformation they had witnessed. The recognition of genuine heroism, the power of truth to change hearts, and the courage it took for Marcus Bush to confront his own failings. Marcus stepped back, giving James the respectful distance that military protocol required. But as he did, he made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his business card, writing something on the back of it. Colonel, he said, handing the card to Colonel Harrison, my company has a foundation that supports veterans and their families. I've written the amount of our next donation on the back of this card. It's not enough to undo what I said today, but maybe it can help honor the service of men and women like Sergeant Mitchell. Colonel Harrison looked at the card and his eyes widened. Marcus had written a figure with more zeros than the foundation had ever received in a single donation. Furthermore, Marcus continued, I want to establish a scholarship fund in Sergeant Mitchell's name for children who have been affected by conflict, children like the ones he saved, so they can get the education they deserve. Sarah Bush looked at her husband with new eyes. This was not the man she had married, the man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. This was someone who had been fundamentally changed by confronting the reality of genuine heroism. As the crowd began to disperse, people stopping to shake Marcus's hand and thank him for his apology, Margaret Mitchell approached him. Mr. Bush, she said quietly, what you did today took courage. My son would be proud to know that his service helped you understand what really matters. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He looked one last time at James Mitchell, standing at his post with perfect discipline, and he understood now that he was looking at something rare and precious in the world. Not just a guard, not just a soldier, but a man who had chosen to dedicate his life to something greater than himself. As Marcus and Sarah walked away from Buckingham Palace, Marcus was already planning the changes he would make to his life and his business. He would never again confuse financial success with human worth. He would never again mock what he didn't understand. And he would spend the rest of his days trying to live up to the example set by a man who had shown him what true strength really looked like. The guard remained at his post, continuing his silent vigil, protecting and serving as he had sworn to do. But something had changed in those few hours. The doubt that had plagued him since returning from Afghanistan, the question of whether his sacrifices meant anything, had been answered by an unlikely source. In the transformation of Marcus Bush, James Mitchell had seen proof that his service did matter, that honor and duty were not outdated concepts but eternal truths that could still change hearts and minds. The sun was setting over London as the day shift of guards prepared to be relieved by their evening counterparts. James Mitchell would soon remove his red coat and tall hat, becoming once again just another young man dealing with the memories of war. But for one day he had served not just as a guard but as a teacher, showing one ignorant man what real heroism looked like, and in doing so, had reminded himself why his service mattered.